Hey guys, stay calm cursory. So, this is Night of the Living Creepypasta, the Halloween special. Wow, I am just blown away by all the cool things you guys submitted. Oh, as for me, I've read 2 creepypasta, and they are in here. The first one is going to be mine, but I'm not going to say or list in the description where the next one's going to be. So if you want to find that one, you do have to listen to it all the way through, or at least partly through. I don't know. So yeah, thank you for everybody's hard work. This is so cool, and I think it makes a really good finale for the month of October. Thank you for participating, and to everybody else, I hope you enjoy this. This took a lot of work, I think, and just kind of a fun thing to do, and I hope everybody enjoys it. And have a happy Halloween. It's Night of the Living Creepypasta. A pile of photographs. A young girl walking home from school found a pile of Polaroid photos lying in the gutter. There were 20 in all, neatly wrapped in a rubber band. She picked them up, and as she walked, she started to browse. The first photo was that of a ghostly white man on a black background, standing just far enough away from the camera that she couldn't make out his features. The girl slid the photo to the back of the stack and looked at the next one. The photo was of the same man, now standing a bit closer. The girl flipped through the next several photos quickly. With each one, the man in the picture came a bit closer, and his features were a bit clearer. Turning the last corner to her house, the girl noticed that the man in the photos seemed to be looking at her, even when she moved the stack from side to side. It frightened her, but she kept flipping them over one by one. By the 19th picture, the man was so close his face completely filled the frame. His expression was the most horrifying the girl had ever seen. Walking up the driveway, she turned to the last photo. This time, instead of an image, there were 2 words. Close enough. Hearing a scream outside their house, the girl's brother rushed to the door and opened it. All he saw was a pile of photographs lying on the doorstep. The top one looked like an extremely pale version of his sister, but she was standing too far back for him to be sure.
A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him that on the way to his room there was a door with no number that was locked, and no one was allowed to enter in there. Especially no one should look inside the room under any circumstances. So he followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, going straight to his room and straight to bed. The next night his curiosity would not leave him alone about the room with no number on the door. He walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. Sure enough, it was locked. He bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom like his, and in the corner was a woman whose skin was completely white. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while. He almost knocked on the door out of curiosity, but decided not to. This disinclination saved his life. He crept away from the door and walked back into his room. The next day he returned to the door and looked through the wide keyhole. This time, all he saw was redness. He couldn't make anything out besides a distinct red colour unmoving. Perhaps the inhabitants of the room knew he was spying the night before and had blocked the keyhole with something red. At this point, he decided to consult the woman at the front desk for more information. She sighed and said, "Did you look through the keyhole?" The man told her that he had, and she said, "Well, I might as well tell you the story. A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in that room. Her ghost haunts it, but these people were not ordinary. They were white all over, except for their eyes, which were red."
Reliquias familiares. Dicen que la locura anda por mi familia, pero yo no estoy de acuerdo. Yo diría que solo hemos tenido unos incidentes desafortunados en mi familia. Una serie de graves incidentes desafortunados que debilitaban a las mentes de mi bisabuelo, mi abuela y más recientemente mi padre. Simplemente, todo estaba fuera de nuestro control. Por ejemplo, mi bisabuelo Esteban no siempre fue el recluso, como me decía mi mamá. Una vez él fue gran ejemplo, biólogo brillante, mujeriego en su juventud y proezas innumerables en las selvas amazónicas y los desiertos medio orientales. Acumuló muchos ricos animales exóticos en su finca. Pero después de la muerte de su esposa, agarró la botella y se encerraba día tras día gritando a nadie en el enorme atrio lleno de insectos y víboras. Con un suspiro desesperado, mi madre me dijo que en las raras ocasiones de verlo, mi bisabuelo casi nunca hablaba de una manera comprensible. Solo farfullaba las jaulas de vidrio como si las criaturas que deslizaban adentro entendían cada palabra. Dicen que por causa de un accidente debido al alcohol, lo hallaron en una jaula de vidrio junto a 5 alacranes de cola ancha. Entonces tenemos a abuela Susana. Todavía me acuerdo de sus pinturas magníficas del bosque que me mostraba. Todavía me acuerdo de cuando ella fue una viejita simpática que nos hacía galletas de canela y pasas con azúcar moreno que salían del horno tan húmedas y calientitas. Por supuesto, esto fue antes de que ella nos diera galletas que contenían cucarachas. Ella quejaba cuando mi mamá nos quitó de la cocina, diciendo: están llenos de lo bueno, y sueños dulces, y chitín. Nunca volví a verla después de eso. Nada más de visitas, abuela. Nada más de las galletas. Nada más de las cucarachas. No sé qué pasa con las cucarachas. Ella empezó a dibujarlas por todas partes. Hallaron su cuerpo en su casa, al lado de una botella de veneno para matar cucarachas. Durante servicios fúnebres en su casa, miré en uno de sus cuadernos. Estaba lleno de dibujos muy detallados de cucarachas y escritos únicos sobre enjambres y zumbidos en sus orejas. Echo de menos a abuela Susana, pero supongo que todos se vuelven locos tarde o temprano, y no lo podía evitar. Ella se veía tan calmada en el ataúd, tan digna. Ella hubiera estado tan orgullosa a partir el mundo así. Pero mi papá, pues admito no estar tan seguro en su caso. Él siempre fue tranquilo, sin quejas y no decía casi nada a nadie. No sé por qué mi madre se casó con él. Tampoco sé por qué valía la pena tener hijos, porque raramente reconocían que yo y mi hermano existían. Tampoco sé qué pensar de mi hermano. Quería a mi papá, creo. A pesar de todo lo que hizo, le quiero. Le quería cuando me puso a dormir como niño, cuando me dio una sonrisa rara después de hacer algo bueno en la escuela, y cuando llegué a casa para encontrar a mi mamá y a mi hermano estrangulados en el jardín. Mi papá se encontraba cerca, jugando con un hormiguero, mirando a las criaturas correr por sus dedos largos y ásperos. La historia de mi familia es muy triste de verdad. No hay mucho orgullo en los hoyitos donde corren los insectos, porque aquí familia y destino no significa nada, puesto que todo lo que importa es entregar comida a la colmena, alimentar el rey. Pero supongo que nuestros incidentes lamentables fueron solo hechos inevitables de supervivencia del más fuerte. Nuestro bisabuelo fue un hombre poderoso, pero hasta las cucarachas pueden ser aplastadas y a pesar de todos sus esfuerzos, las diminutas hormigas no pueden escapar la matanza del escarabajo insuperable. Las garras y la concha y las alas y las mandíbulas me dan escalofríos al acariciarlos. Y el momento infinitesimal de tensión superficial, cuando el caparazón dobla un poquito antes de romperse debajo del diente, es tan estimulante. Aún en esta celda acolchada vienen a mí, en mi silencio, para alimentarme, para darme las bendiciones del rey con las antenas, piernas y ganchos. Dicen que la locura anda por mi familia, pero yo no estoy de acuerdo. El escarabajo susurró algo diferente, mientras que excavó dentro de mi cerebro.
Last of the Sparks by Jacob Newell. Back in February of 2008, I decided that I needed a change from my monotonous life. Whether that change would come in the form of a new job or a new toothbrush, I didn't know. I was never the most adventurous person. I always found it difficult to veer away from my comfort zone, and the limit of my existence usually depended on which book I was reading at the time. It took me a while to realize that my happiness often derived from the stories that my mind was living in. I was the avid bookworm, as miserable synecdoche as that is. Once I realized my true outlet, I immediately knew what I wanted. I purchased a small shop, quit my boring job, renovated the building, and transformed it into a bookstore. I had never been happier. The next 2 years were the best of my life. The store had become a huge hit with locals. My perspective on work had completely altered, and I was feeling genuinely happy for the first time since my childhood. It was the winter of 2010 that she walked into my store. She stepped inside out of the snow and approached me with a large bin bag. Etchings of age covered her pale, hate face and hands. Slamming the bag on the counter, she simply said, "These are for you." I looked inside the bag to find a selection of some of the greatest novels ever written. Why? Do you want money for these, or some kind of book trade? I asked, confused. No, they're yours to have. Take them. She gave me a feeling of uneasiness. Her dirty gray fringe slightly concealed her face as a cold gaze met my vision. Are you sure you want me to have them? Wouldn't you rather sell them? No, I have no use for them, nor for money. Okay, thank you. What's your name? Lucy. She muttered her final words and left my store. I found it all too strange that somebody would give away such great books for nothing, but I suppose some people are just nice. I made my way home that night and took the books with me, so that I could go through them. I piled them up on the table. I was surprised to see all of them were in fantastic condition. A couple of them seemed to be first editions, and others were versions I have never even seen before. It took me a moment to realize, but the novels I was looking at were not as I remembered them to be. The first book I picked up was The Green Mile. On the front cover, There's an image of John Coffrey smiling and holding 2 dead naked girls. I opened them up and flicked through the pages. In this version of the novel, he was in fact guilty of the rape and murder of both children. I made my way to the end of the book and read through the execution scene. All the officers who had originally grown to love John Coffrey in the original novel were now laughing uncontrollably and screaming racial taunts as he was being executed. My eyes had seen enough, my stomach had felt enough too. The next book I picked up was The Catcher in the Rye. The artwork on the front page seemed to be of a dead body splatter in the street, drawn from an aerial view. I flicked through a book until I reached chapter 14. After Holden Caulfield speaks of messing with the idea of suicide, he suddenly breaks down in tears and jumps from the window, cracking his skull on the pavement below. The book abruptly ends after that. I then pick up Lord of the Flies. The defining image on this novel was of a large child with the face of a pig. He was covered in blood and surrounded by decaying corpses. After grazing through the pages, I reached a point of the story in which Piggy is described as being non-human, vicious, and a hungry animal. A chapter or so later, Jack insults Piggy, which leads him to losing his temper and ripping him apart. Piggy then proceeds to kill and eat the rest of the children. The remainder of the book was the same line repeated over and over. Piggy sat alone on the island, waiting for death. I read through the few books that were left in the pile, and they all have been changed in some sick way. The Great Gatsby, Wuthering Heights, To Kill a Mockingbird, Ulysses, every one of them. Just as I reached the bottom of the pile, I noticed that the final book was one that I have never even heard of before. It was called Last of the Sparks. I found this slightly unnerving, as I immediately paired it with my name, Aaron Sparks. Still, it was just a book. The front cover was of 6 gravestones with words too small to be read etched into the granite. I looked up into the top corner of the book and noticed there's a sell-by date on it, June 4th, 2013. I nervously opened it up to the beginning of the story. Chapter 1, Alice Sparks. My stomach dropped as I read my mother's name upon the page. I felt dizzy and confused as I anxiously made my way through the chapter. It seemed to detail a regular day in the life of the character until I reached the last page. Alice was crossing over the road when the heel of her shoe broke, causing her to fall. She didn't get to her feet fast enough, and the speeding driver struck her, puncturing both of her lungs. I felt sick to my stomach. I put the book down and got straight to bed, hoping for some sleep. I lay awake all night as countless questions ran through my mind. The only thought that managed to put me to sleep was, it's just a book. The next morning when I got into work, I was feeling worse for wear. It wasn't until around lunchtime that I began to perk up and regain a bit of energy. Then the phone rang. I answered the call to my father crying on the other end. Immediately I knew what had happened. I closed the shop and ran to the hospital, but it was already too late. She was gone. Hit by a speeding driver, they said. I spent the next couple of weeks helping take care of my dad. Me, my brother, and my sisters stayed with him in turns and looked after him. We all looked after one another. It wasn't until after a few months later that I picked up The Last of the Sparks. This scared me so much last time. I opened it up to page 37, and there it was, Chapter 2, Patrick Sparks. The story was more of the same, a day in the life, right up until the part where he shot himself in the kitchen whilst on the phone to his son. I ran to the phone to speak to him, cover him, but then I realized what I may be doing. The phone picked up at the other end, and before I could say a word, he was gone. I got my black suit and tie out once more, and repeated the same process for another parent. It ruined us all. After the funeral, I refused to touch the book. What if I had been causing these deaths by reading it? I couldn't go through it all again. On the Christmas Eve of 2011, I got a phone call from my brother's wife, Heather. Will had been putting up Christmas lights on the roof, and they slipped on ice and broke his neck. He died almost instantly. I threw the phone at the wall and began to sob into my sleeve. Anger took the pain away for a moment as I picked up the book and read through chapter 3. It was exactly as Heather had described. I fell asleep and woke up the next day with the book still on my lap. I decided to check who's going to go next out of me and my sisters and hopefully warn them, or myself, in some way. I turned the page, chapter 4, Mary and Sarah Sparks. I rushed through the story as fast as I could until I reached the end. Both of my sisters and their partners would drown in the lake after colliding with another car on a one-way bridge. The same sickly feeling took over me. I met with my sisters later that day to exchange gifts, and I told them as calmly as I could muster to be careful when driving. I had to sound as sane as possible, as possibly mentioning the lake, the bridge, and the fact that all 4 of them would be in the car at the same time. But at least I told them. Mary and Sarah drowned 8 months later in August 2012. After I went to the funeral, I picked up the book and turned to the final pages. Chapter 5, Aaron Sparks. But I didn't read it. I'd rather not live in fear for so long, so I decided to save it for near the time. After all, there was a sell-by date on it. Everything has been normal for the past 5 months or so. Although I've lost interest in reading, so I'm back to my old miserable self. I questioned myself every day as to why she was doing this to me. But it didn't matter, as it was all going to be over soon anyway. I've just finished reading the final chapter. It's June 4th, 2013, and I'm sitting in my basement waiting for her to arrive. That's the way the ending goes. Or so I've read.
I was home alone for the week, as my family had gone on vacation while I had to stay and work. It was around 2 a.m., and I'd stayed up to watch a scary movie in the dark in my basement. I was intent on really scaring myself and seeing how far into terror I could really go, while still knowing I was safe in my own home. It was then that I heard pounding footsteps on the first floor. This was a common annoying occurrence when my family was home. Every time they passed through the front hallway past the basement door, I heard their footsteps. This time, fear immediately shot through me at the sound. My reflex was to turn the television off immediately. The basement door was up a flight of steps and around a corner, so whoever it was would not have seen any light. I heard the basement door handle click and turn as I sat in absolute darkness. I moved slowly so as to be absolutely silent and crawled behind our large television. As I passed it inch by inch, I noted with panic that its black screen still dimly glowed. I heard footsteps coming down carpeted but creaky stairs. I froze in my hiding place, listening. For many long minutes, I heard nothing. Had the intruder seen the television's afterglow, or had it faded in time? Was he standing in the pitch dark listening for me? I seemed to lie there in total silence for an interminably long time. My panic began to fade, and I began to think more clearly. Had I really heard an intruder? Could somebody possibly be standing there in silence for so long without making any noise? The basement was so exceedingly quiet that the silence itself began to hurt my ears. Could the unknown person really avoid any noise from shuffling or breathing or anything else? If there was an intruder, he was still in the basement, because the creaky stairs were incredibly loud, the door handle clicked, and he wouldn't know to mask his footsteps on the first floor so they couldn't be heard down here. I began counting in my head, trying to pass the time, as drool fell from my mouth onto the carpet. I didn't dare risk the sound of swallowing. I reached 60 seconds once, twice, 30 times, 60 times. By now my fear had faded and I was more confused than anything. I estimated I'd been crouched in the absolute black for almost 2 hours and had still heard nothing. If there was an intruder, none of this made sense. Finally, I decided I'd have to make a move. If I did nothing, eventually the sun would come up and shine in through the small basement windows. And worse, I began to smell something horrible and cloying. Slowly, ever so slowly, I began inching my way towards the stairs by way of the walls. If someone was standing there in the dark, I should be able to go around them and then make a break up the stairs. Meanwhile, the horrible odor grew stronger. Had something died down here last night? No living person would smell like that. Terrible images of some sort of corpse monster listening for me in the dark erupted in my thoughts, and I moved as fast as I could without making a sound. Just as I finally approached the stairs, there was an enormous clatter, as of something falling or collapsing on the floor. It was at that moment that I leapt forward and crashed up the stairs, running out through the open basement door and my wide-open front door. Now certain that someone was in my house, I called the police from my cell phone and watched my house from afar. The police came, checked inside the house, and grimly came back to question me. They'd found a body in my house, my elderly neighbor who seemed to have died of a heart attack. Their belief was that I must have left the front door unlocked and he must have wandered in my house while dying, looking for help. At first, I felt horrible, thinking that I had sat there in the dark while the old man literally died a few feet away. Then it occurred to me, what the hell was the loud noise of things falling that last prompted me to bolt up the stairs and out of the house? I asked the police and they confirmed. The back door of my house had been left open as well, near a single bare footprint in the mud. Somehow, for some reason I'll never know, there was someone else in that basement with us, silent, waiting, and listening in the dark over the fresh corpse of an old man.
Dead men swinging in a tree. How many dead men do you see? Tongue turned blue and face gone grey. Watch them as they twist and sway. The first one killed the butcherman, then cooked him in a frying pan. Served him to his hungry guests, gave them seconds on request. The next one with his smile and sweets stole poor children of the streets. To men who dressed unsavory, he sold them into slavery. Breaking into a home at night, the thief he had a nasty fright. Filled his foolish head with ale, woke in the morning a county jail. The artist with his daunting skills tried his hand at painting bills, but caught in rain he wasn't done. When Hank he'd used it start to run, with promises of great return. Taking gold he did not earn, bundled it up out of sight, quietly slipped off into the night. 3 houses into ashes burned, the sheriff with no place to turn. Did spy a stranger to his town, locked him up and beat him down. Dead men swinging in a tree. How many dead men do you see? 6 feet long and 6 men wide, round their necks and nose be tied.
The tale I'm about to relate is as old as the world itself. It is a tale of hatred, the kind that stems from fear, which in turn takes root from ignorance and foolishness. But it is also the tale of Victor, who recently moved into a charming little country home so as to flee the insanity of big city life. However, this does not take into account the chauvinistic tendencies of the locals, who do not perceive his arrival as a favorable omen. But for the time being, Victor knows nothing, and what he doesn't know cannot hurt him. Yet. The next morning, while stepping out for a breath of air, Victor attempts to make initial contact with one of his neighbors. Imagine his surprise when he watched his former return to his cottage without even having the basic courtesy to return his salutations. An isolated case, presumes Victor, who immediately attempts to greet his other neighbor. But once again he is met with the same reaction of mistrust. His heart filled with bitterness, Victor returns to his home, cursing the closed-mindedness of the country folk. The next day, having quickly gotten over that incident, Victor takes advantage of his morning stroll to visit the village, but he rapidly finds himself on the receiving end of the local tittle-tattle generally reserved for strangers from the city. A few days later, Victor is initially surprised to find that his dog has disappeared. Victor wonders how it could have freed himself without assistance, when suddenly, from over the neighbor's hedge, the distinct resonance of a party kindles his curiosity. He decides to take a look, and what he sees horrifies him. There, before his very eyes, roasting on a spit, rotates the carcass of an animal corresponding exactly to the build of his trusted companion. Victor needn't see any more to fill in the gruesome blanks of the story. Unfortunately, too focused on thinking up the worst possible scenarios, his presence is noticed by his neighbor's child. Since suspicion is contagious, Victor equips himself with a home security system and a generator, convinced that isolation from the others is a necessity. At nightfall, not too far from there, a desperate villager searches for his son. Disheartened, he approaches his closest neighbor to ask for advice. Despite not actually having seen the boy, the neighbor mentions how the stranger locked himself up in his home after being caught spying. Having agreed on the venture, the two decide to investigate for themselves, but the instant they are detected by the security system, they flee the scene, henceforth convinced that the stranger is plotting a dreadful scheme, perhaps even being the one responsible for the disappearance of the boy. The next few days for Victor are steadily punctuated with the repeating ringing of the security system's alarm, the frequency of which increases all the time. Evidently, the system is no longer adequate enough to keep the villagers from snooping around Victor's home. Panicked, he sees no other alternative than to elaborate a plan to guarantee his protection. Proving destiny is indeed a cruel mistress, a chance electrical blackout plunges the entire village into complete darkness. Darkness, which the villagers immediately blame the stranger for, assuming a new ordeal he's putting the boy through required all the electrical power of the area. Inspired by an energy which in completely different conditions would have allowed them to create extraordinary things, they convince themselves to torch the ogre's home. If only Victor had been an actual ogre and not a brilliant inventor, the villagers would not be confronted with what he had in store for them. All their hatred towards him pent up in a 40-ton robot of rampaging metallic fuel. Unfortunately, as Victor continued to pursue the now fleeing villagers, he failed to notice that the generator, which supplied his creation with power, began to falter. Evidently, his creation came to a halt, but before anyone could fathom what had occurred, it was already too late. If vengeance is a false god, it indeed guides man into blindness, losing sight of what is truly essential. The next morning, an electrician repairing a problem on a major conduit that caused a significant blackout the night before reported seeing a small boy and a dog merrily skipping out of a nearby forest. When interrogated, the poor child could bring no further explanation concerning the bizarre devastation of the village of Paranoland.
In the winter of 1944, with overtaxed supply lines in the Ardennes, a medic in the German army had completely run out of plasma, bandages, and antiseptic. During one particularly bad round of mortar fire, his encampment was a bloodbath. Those who survived claimed to have heard, amidst the screams and barked commands of their lieutenant, someone cackling with almost girlish glee. The medic had made his rounds during the fire, in almost complete darkness as he had so many times before, but never had he been this short on supplies. No matter. He would do his duty. He had always prided himself on his resourcefulness. The bombardment moved to other ends of the line, and most men dropped off to sleep in the dark, still hours of the morning, New Year's Day, 1945. The men awoke at first light with screams. They discovered that their bandages were not typical bandages at all, but hunks and strips of human flesh. Several men had been given fresh blood transfusions, yet there had been no blood supplies available. Each treated man was almost completely covered head to toe with the maroon stain of blood. The medic was found sitting on an ammunition tin, staring off into space. When one man approached him and tapped him on the shoulder, his tunic fell off to reveal that large patches of his skin, muscle, and sinew had been stripped from his torso, and his body was almost completely dried of blood. In one hand was a scalpel, and in the other a blood transfusion vial. None of the men treated for wounds that night in that camp saw the end in January 1945.
The Diner by Flaky Porcupine. We see the same faces passing by every day, my faithful wife and I. Ghosts walking by our windows, their faces gaunt and pale, their speech slurred, almost hauntingly so. They held up signs, although most which read similar messages. Will work for food. Feed me. Spare change? You had to feel sorry for the beggars and the homeless on the streets when you run a respected neighborhood diner. Their faces unwashed, we thought that we could not just feed them for free. The regular patrons would always demand the same treatment. That would be unfair and unjust. Yet at the same time, we couldn't just leave them out there to rot either. We had to help them. We looked at the picture of our son, who went and never returned from the war, and that was how our idea struck. The next day, when the night was going by lazily, we let this one man in. He introduced himself as Kyle. Kyle was one of those people. He had been sleeping in alleyways in the outskirts of town for years after he was laid off and lost his home, unable to make a living for himself with how bad the economy was doing. He ordered a brisket, the diner's specialty. In the kitchen, as she was preparing the man's food, my wife asked me if what we were doing was right, if our method, if this was a way to truly guide them. After a long discussion, I assured her that our friend Kyle would be thankful for us for helping him along his way. Kyle's eyes lit up as we brought the plate out, and he began to chow down quickly. He was a hungry one. We wondered when was the last time he ever had a good meal. His mouth was almost mechanical in how quickly he took it in and chewed and swallowed each bite down. With a small smile, he thanked us for the wonderful meal. We just smiled on, out of courtesy more than anything else. He blacked out and was later pronounced dead by the police. We covered it up well. After all, it turned out that the homeless man had a failed disease and could have died any day. A bit of luck was on our side there. The second, the third, the fourth. All these wretched souls that were set free, free of the suffering from homelessness, disease, and starvation. Our efforts were put at rest after one certain customer came in. It still haunts us to this day. Not a moment goes by where we want to think about what we had done that one evening. He told us that his name was Jason as I held the door open for him. He was a very scruffy man in ragged and dirty clothing. It was an eyesore just staring at the poor son of a bitch for too long. He needed help, and we were the ones to set him on the path to a better place, a special and celestial kind of home up high. God was calling him to take him home with wide open arms. I felt my bones and my blood. We gave him a big meal of steak to eat, and like the rest, he did not seem to notice that it had been spiked with poison. Oh, how he loved it. He told us how it reminded him of his mother's cooking when he was a child. We smiled in unison and waited for his freedom, and soon it came as always as we watched his eyes close for the very last time. The investigator, per usual, came as soon as possible. Surprisingly still, they have not suspected a single thing despite the bodies piling up, at least until we turned ourselves in. The man was apparently an amnesiac after a tragedy a few years back. Doctors looking over him noticed that the slum was wearing dog tags around his throat, and my heart sank as he read the name. I was confused at first, but then it struck home. It turned out that our poor, dear son never did die in the war after all.
Gone in a flash. Several years ago, 3 men approached a house in the middle of the Canadian countryside. Apparently, the circuit breaker in the house failed to trigger on a surge of electricity, causing a small fire. The breaker needed to be replaced. Of the 3 men, one was a professional electrician, one an intern, his assistant, and the third was a supervisor who wanted to monitor the situation. it would have been a routine procedure. Once they arrived, they parked their truck in front of the building and proceeded into the room with the breaker. However, once the electrician saw the breaker, he wanted to check whether or not the circuit was live. After all, he argued, it wouldn't be safe to just start working without taking the proper precautions. But the supervisor would have none of it. This was just a simple replacement job. Switch the old parts for the new. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. Time is money, and there was no sense in wasting it to be overly precautious. The two argued with one another, but the electrician soon left to get his voltmeter so he could test the breaker. The supervisor could only scoff at that. I've got your test right here. Then, while the electrician was on his way to the truck, the supervisor grabbed some exposed wires on both ends of the worn breaker. A flash. And then an explosion that sounded like an artillery shell. And then an inferno. The transformer overloaded. The supervisor was the first. The fire and the electrocution engulfed him until you really couldn't recognize the man anymore. Just a black body on the ground. The explosion reached all the way to the electrician, who was halfway to the truck at this point, and burned him on nearly 30% of his body, including his heart and lungs. The shock had killed him. But the one to suffer the worst? That was the intern. During this entire event, the intern had been staying in the room with the breaker. Not really wanting to get involved in the fight, he just stayed back and let the situation figure itself out. He was only a few feet away from the supervisor when everything went white. He suffered third-degree burns on 99% of his body. However, he did not die. He lived through the entire ordeal. He felt every second of it. He was soon rescued by paramedics and taken to surgery. He could no longer see. He could no longer hear. He could no longer speak, or move, or eat, or breathe. He was placed in a vacuum tube and fed medicine, nutrients, water, and air through hoses connected to his body. Even the slightest twitch, the smallest breeze, caused an unthinkable amount of agony for him. And yet, he was still alive. He was still alive to enjoy a life in which he could never live, where he could only feel pain every single day. And every time he felt it, he relived that singular moment when the supervisor acted as he did and destroyed his life forever. Gone in a flash.
The Trap. In Berlin, after World War II, money was short, supplies were tight, and it seemed like everyone was hungry. At that time, people were telling the tale of a young woman who saw a blind man picking his way through a crowd. The two began to talk, and the man asked her for a favor. Would she please deliver a letter to an address on its envelope? It was on her way home, so she agreed. She started out to deliver the message when she turned around to see if there was anything else the blind man needed. But she spotted him hurrying away from her through the crowd without his glasses or cane. She became suspicious, so she went to the police. When the police paid a visit to the address on the envelope, they made a gruesome discovery. 3 butchers had been harvesting human flesh and selling it to the starving people. And what was in the envelope the man had given to the woman? A note. that simply read, "This is the last one I am sending you today. Save me a breast."
In the 1970s, the city of Perth, Western Australia, experienced an urban sprawl that made its suburbs clamber up and down the coast of the Indian Ocean. These suburbs, tenuously connected by fragile railways like a spiderweb, was where I lived as a child. These novel infrastructure developments meant that I was isolated to only my hometown, unable to find a reliable way to roam. For that reason, my friends and I would often spend a lot of time at the namesake of our suburb, Lake Joondalup. Our group was a bit of a motley, connected by our own tenuous thread. We all loved to explore the bush, which at that point had yet to be swept aside by the development. Now, despite a wide circle of friends with similar interests, I only really felt close to a young boy called Tristan. He was a large child with a kind manner and a jagged row of white teeth that contrasted sharply with his dark skin and soft features. We both loved the night. We loved the late evenings where a new world opened up to us around the lake. We would continue to explore the tree-lined banks after most kids went home for dinner. This day, we'd been skipping stones across the lake while discussing the short assignment our teacher had set. Tristan, being Aboriginal, had been given the assignment of finding out the meaning of many of the words we had in our day-to-day life that had come to the first Australians. "So," I said, tossing another rock into the lake, what does Joondalup mean?" "I actually know that one." Tristan had picked up a larger rock than usual, and he weighed it in his hand as he thought about the best way to articulate the answer. "It means place of shining, or place of white." "No way, that's lame," I said with all the serious a 5th grader could muster. "You're lame." Tristan ditched the rock at the water beside me, and some of it splashed onto my new white socks. I charged at him, trying to avenge myself with the inevitable wrath of my mother. He turned and legged it, with surprising swiftness for such a large boy. We both ran through the bush, our chase taking us right along the edge of the lake. The next thing I knew, Tristan, maybe 3 or 4 paces in front of me, tripped. I saw him stumble, his ankle twisting in an odd fashion, before he keeled over and plunged straight into the dark water of the lake. The banks were a sharp, 2-foot drop into the water that was deep enough to submerge him entirely. He surfaced. "Christ!" he squealed as I kneeled on the bank to try to help him out. "It's so cold." I didn't respond. Behind him was a white shape, blurry in the dark water, but rapidly sharpening like an inverse silhouette. "Yeah, let's go." I reached out to help him when suddenly the shape seemed to unfurl, wrapping itself around Tristan and dragging him downwards. My heart began to jackhammer against my ribs, causing the blood to pound in my head. Tristan surfaced and flailed. I didn't hesitate, grabbing the back of his shirt collar and pulling him upwards as a pair of milk-white arms, each finger tipped with gleaming claws, snatched at him from the lake. He was hurt bad. His ankle was swelling and already mottled with bruising. I tried to drag him, carry him, but he was far too heavy. We stumbled along the rocky path, my legs nearly buckling as Tristan leaned on me. It wasn't far from the break in the trees and the road beyond, but we barely got 20 feet from the lake before I looked back. Darkened against the reflected moonlight, I saw the creature standing on the banks. Its form is etched like a carving on the inside of my skull. It had a human body, with broad, masculine shoulders and a long neck, like that of a deer, except that it stopped abruptly, like it had its head severed at the base of the skull. That was not the worst part of it, though. The best way I can describe its legs were how one would expect a child to stack Lego blocks. They were many jointed, from the ankle upwards. They stacked on top of one another, but not quite matching up, giving the impression of a jagged zigzag. I began to whimper, and Tristan stopped to look behind him. I felt his grip on me slacken, and he also made a soft noise. I knew the noise. It was when your body was seizing up from the inside out, the nerves firing rapidly as your body began to employ its emergency response to fly. "Let's go, let's go!" Our pace quickened. Behind us, I could hear the rustling of the undergrowth and the light step of a pursuant. We stumbled faster. Tristan's face was red and puffy, and the roaring in my ears had reached a deafening crescendo. We dared not to look back, our eyes fixed ahead on the murky light of the streetlights. Tristan jerked, and was lifted out of my grip. I tried to hold on to him, but I found myself shaken off, like a dog shaking its prey. I flew through the air, crashing into a tree and slumping into the undergrowth. My vision filled with stars, turning into flashes in eventual darkness, as Tristan's terrified screams faded away into unconsciousness. When I came to, it was silent. I sat up, my breath ragged. It was well into the night, and a chill had descended onto the bush, meaning it was into the early AMs. I tried to stand up. The world lurched and turned on its side as a flash of pain threw me to the ground again. I struggled to get up, but through it, I began to feel unsettled. I could hear footsteps, seconds apart, like something was taking a step and waiting. I lay down again, peering through the leaves. It was itchy and sticky down there, but I felt deep in my stomach that what was out there did not have any good intentions towards me. It took a few minutes to appear on the path, but there it was, that thing again. It turned out that it was not waiting. Its legs were lengthening, allowing it to take huge strides. Now I realized it was stepping backwards. Yes, I could make out its shoulder blades and the jagged line of its spine as it walked up the path. Its neck was swaying, as if looking around behind it. As it drew level, I had to bite down on my tongue to stop me from crying out. It was carrying Tristan's limp body in its arms, his dead weight barely seeming to register as the creature cradled him like a baby. It drew level as I was processing the sight of my friend, and I saw that at the end of that neck, where I had not identified a head, was a face. A flat, human face. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the creature to go away. We walked up and down the path, and in through the bush. Past within feet of me, I could hear the sound of its joints popping as it moved. Its shadow blotted out the moonlight periodically, but it never found me. They found me just after sunup. I was still curled at the base of the ancient white gum, sobbing silently. They nearly missed me, as I was obscured by a thicket of some spiny shrub, but there I was, clutching my knees to my chest and whimpering softly. They did not find Tristan, but I found clumps of his hair and scraps of his clothing on the undergrowth, at about an adult's shoulder height, like he had been carried. I gave a statement to the police and was given therapy. About a week later, a strange whitish scum floated to the surface of the lake, collecting at the banks and cutting the water in a horrible film. The scum was found to be human fat that proved to be a DNA match to the kidnapping victim, Tristan Cole. The memory faded from my mind. The disappearance was chalked up to a suspected homicide. The vibrant memory became a distant shape, backlit by the moon and reflection of water. Sometimes my fear would rear its ugly head when I drove past the solid wall of trees that made up the edge of the lake reserve, but it was nothing more than a traumatic event folded away into a corner of my mind. That was, until last week, the thought of the creature was refreshed, given a new coat of fear-induced detail. Running in the local paper, The Weekender, was an article on new findings of the etymology of the word Joondalup. New research suggested that Joondalup meant place of the creature that could only walk backwards.
Please come. A 15-year-old boy in a small town in Maryland sat down at his computer after getting home from school one day. He turned it on and logged into an instant messaging program, and was then surprised to receive a message from a classmate of his who had been absent that day. It consisted of 2 words, "Please come." Confused, the boy sent a reply, asking why he'd been absent that day. After 2 more messages and 15 minutes with no response, he decided to get on his bike and head over to his classmate's house. It was a short ride, only about 5 minutes away. When he got to the house, he found the door was unlocked. Inside, partially dried blood was splattered over the walls and floors, and an unrecognizable figure was crumpled against the far wall. It was missing an arm and a leg, and bloody streaks on the floor led away from the body and into the kitchen. The boy slammed the door closed and immediately called 911 on his cell phone. When the police arrived, they found 3 corpses, as well as tracks leading away from the house from the back door. The forensics report concluded that the entire family, the boy's classmate and his parents, had been killed sometime the previous night.
A man named Joseph Blackwell came to Philadelphia on a business trip. He stayed with friends in a big house they owned in a nearby city. That night they had a good time visiting, but when Mr. Blackwell went to bed, he tossed and turned and couldn't sleep. Sometime during the night he heard a car turn into the driveway. He went to the window to see who was arriving at such a late hour. In the moonlight he saw a long black hearse filled with people. The driver of the hearse looked up at him. When Blackwell saw the man's strange face, he couldn't help but shudder. The driver called to him, "There is room for one more." The driver waited for a minute or 2, and then drove away. Mr. Blackwell was clearly shaken by this, as when he did go back to bed, it took him a rather long time to go to sleep. In the morning, Blackwell told his friends what had happened. "You were dreaming," they responded. "I must have been," he murmured, "but I could have sworn I was awake." After breakfast, he headed back to Philadelphia. He spent the day high above the rest of the city in one of the new office buildings. Late in the afternoon, he was waiting for an elevator to take him back down to the first floor. But when the elevator arrived and the door opened, it was a little too crowded for his liking. Some of the faces also looked eerily familiar. One of the passengers looked at him. "There's room for one more," he said. The man looked strikingly like the driver of the hearse. A tremble threatened to present itself, but he remained composed. Blackwell only politely declined. "No thank you, I'll get on the next one down." The doors closed and the elevator started down. Shrieks and screams were heard as the elevator plummeted downward, followed shortly after by a crashing sound. The elevator had fallen to the bottom of the shaft. Everyone aboard was killed.
A Minnesota couple decided to vacation to Florida during the winter. They planned to stay at the very same hotel where they had spent their honeymoon 20 years earlier. Because of hectic schedules, it was difficult to coordinate their travel schedules, so the husband left Minnesota and flew to Florida on Thursday. His wife would fly down the following day. The husband checked into the hotel. There was a computer in his room, so he decided to send an email to his wife. However, he accidentally left one letter out in her email address, and without realizing his error, he sent the email. Meanwhile, somewhere in Houston, a widow had just returned home from her husband's funeral. He was a minister of many years who was called home to glory following a sudden heart attack. The widow decided to check her email, expecting messages from relatives and friends. After reading the first message, she fainted. The widow's son rushed into the room, found his mother on the floor, and saw the computer screen which read, "To my loving wife. Subject, I've arrived. Date, 16th of May, 2003. I know you're surprised to hear from me. They have computers here now, and you are allowed to send emails to your loved ones. I've just arrived and have been checked in. I see that everything has been prepared for your arrival tomorrow. Looking forward to seeing you then. Hope your journey is not as uneventful as mine was. P.S. Sure is hot down here."
I have always been uneasy driving alone at night. It was worse the first few times when I had just gotten my license, but the nagging fear has never gone away to this day. It's disorienting to look into the mirrors and see nothing, and I mean nothing but the consuming blackness of the night. It makes me hesitant to check the mirrors should I see this dark void, or worse, someone sitting in my backseat staring at me. In the summer of 2013, I found myself driving home alone, Highway 902 from a party. It was almost midnight, and needless to say, it was pitch black. As was usual at night, I was on edge. I had the radio off, and could hear nothing but the muffled roar of tires on the pavement, and the dull hum of the engine. I stole a glance into the middle rearview mirror, and saw nothing but blackness through the back window. I know that I looked backward and saw nothing. I'm sure of it. Just the seemingly endless blackness of the night. I remember it so clearly because not 10 seconds later a car passed me to the left, headlights on. I had one of those sudden adrenaline rushes, like when you think you see a person outside your bedroom window when it's just a tree, or when you start awake at night with a feeling of falling. 10 seconds earlier, nothing had been behind me. Suddenly, a car. I drove all the way home shivering and knowing something was off. The next morning, I found 2 sets of scratches near the back of my van. One was on the left rear, one was on the right. The car was pretty old, they could have been there for months, but that was the first time that I distinctly remember seeing them. In hindsight, there are 2 possibilities for what happened that night. Possibility 1, by some glitch in reality or something paranormal, this other car has somehow appeared behind me, within 10 seconds of me checking my mirror. Like some weird ghost crap or something. However, the second option is what makes my blood run cold whenever I consider it. It didn't even occur to me months after the fact, but it makes me dread driving alone at night even more. Possibility 2. The car was normal. It had approached me from the rear and passed me to my left. However, something large and white, and as black as the night, had been clinging to the rear of my car, obscuring my view through the window and leaving deep scratches on the sides, and I had inadvertently driven it home with me.